Good afternoon, everyone. A warm welcome to our respected panelists and each and every one of you to FinSec Conclave 2023. So we are gathered here for the interesting discussions on API banking and finance, how to alleviate security threats and privacy concerns. So personally, I'm very curious for this topic and looking forward to this fruitful and informative discussions. So let me take a minute to introduce our panelists for this session. Mr. Sandeep Kamble, founder and CTO of Securely 7. Mr. Vijay, CISO, Indian Bank. Mr. Nilesh Singoi, CISO, FinCare Bank. Mr. Vinaya Satyanarayan, Senior Director, Project Management, Quick Hill. And Mr. Siddharth Vishwanath, Risk Consulting Partner, PwC. May I call upon the speakers for the panel?
Hi, thanks for setting us up. Good afternoon, everyone. Today we are going to have a session. Hopefully it's going to be quite interactive and you'll possibly enjoy it. It's basically around, how do we work in this world which is full of APIs? I mean, frankly, if you really think about it today, when we make a payment, right, on some of the payment apps, what's happening at the back end? The back end is basically an API talking to the banking system. And you can get your balance confirmation, or you actually transact and you make bank transfers. So we are actually living in this world of API or the economy. I mean, it's in many ways like we are in the world of API economy. So I just wanted to start off with you just to share some thoughts around what are some of the use cases in the API context, and if you can demystify it.
Sure, thank you. So look at the banking, core banking system, CBS, what we call, used to be at the center of the universe when we talk about banking. That was a few years back. But over time, because core banking systems are very large systems, very complex and monolith systems, making them changes to them all the time is not easy or advisable. So what has been done is that banks have been strategically working to hollow the core and build the systems of engagement around the core banking. So all of that communication would happen through APIs. So that's the first thing, very important use case of core banking, of the APIs. So APIs today has become the center of universe, if I were to say. There lots of communication, as you said, mobile app to backend communication is API. Then lots of external use cases of APIs where we connect with so many providers of services or information or what we call digital public infrastructure, like, Aadhars or PAN card verification, any kind of KYC documentation verification through APIs. We connect through credit bureaus and so many use cases external where we are seeking, information from outside. And then there are use cases where we become the providers of information. And like, if we, what we call API banking, where say a fintech wants to offer a, savings account to their customers, then they connect to a bank at the back end and using API. So these are the various use cases.
No, thanks, Nilesh. And maybe Vijay, let me turn to you. And, clearly there's a lot of API banking that's happening all around, right? If you could share some thoughts around what are the risks that are getting associated with this API? Are there any risks, or it's really seamless and we're all safe and secure?
Actually not. See, when it comes to API, the most important thing is the API key. Just in case the API key is lost, everything is in the open. And in fact, when it comes to APIs, there are multiple issues which could probably be existing. One is the way the API has been designed. And then there could be misconfiguration, which can happen. And APIs are vulnerable to multiple things. I could just give few examples. One is injection vulnerabilities. And then, of course, it could also have an issue wherein, of course, data will mass overflow, meaning to say that the information, what is supposed to be passed across from one particular thing to the other, could be expected to be X, but it will be actually Y. That means you are trying to overboard the other connecting application with so much of data which could be misused, and that's another big problem. That way, in fact, I could keep on saying a lot of things, but generally if you happen to refer to the OWASP standards, when it comes to API integration, you have multitude of issues which are existing. But yes, we can secure them, but you ought to be as well cautious. That's very, very important as part of the whole cycle as such.
No, so clearly you're saying that, look, a lot of data could be potentially exfiltrated, using APIs. So that's clearly a risk.
If
And
it is misconfigured and it's not properly assessed, first of all, the API, whenever it's being integrated, it should not be just the fact that you just integrate the API. You should study exactly how that API behaves, do a complete analysis of it, and then most important thing is when you happen to integrate, you should do all the checks for false alarms, which probably be coming up. So that is something which we need to do, or rather to say, I will use the word abusive testing of the API. That is something which need to be done. So that gives a very clear clarity that the integration is seamless and at the same time secure.
sure, thanks. Sandeep, do you want to add something?
Yeah, definitely. I think I agree to sir what he's trying to say about we should deploy ops, stop it, identify input validation. But let me go back one step back. All right, why do we use the API in first place? Basically, we are really want to move away from a traditional web application where the real-time data is going to impact your UX, because UX is now I would say, revenue-generating machine, and if you don't have great UX on your web application or mobile application, probably it's not going to give you a user good experience, and this is where you lose customers, right? But coming back to your questions, I believe it's totally depend on the architecture that has been used by the applications or APIs, right? So let's consider maybe your APIs are using a multi-tenant system, right? So in this case, when we look at the multi-tenant, we think that, okay, everything is isolated. Probably the database is different. Maybe it's located into some other places. But there are unique keys that has been used during this managing these tenants, right? So in this case, I believe we should also think about what are the possibility. Maybe there is a cross-tenant communication through the APIs. Maybe the organization A might access organization B data. Just one of the examples, the sir was mentioning about we do have the CBS API, right? We do have a payment API where we receive payment from the EUPI, NEFT. Maybe we are receiving from the other VPA, which is the latest one, right? And we also have the collection part for the bank. And we also have an operating part, right? Where we used to create accounts, open accounts, and there are a lot of possibilities, right? So in this case, we need to broaden up, and eventually you will be able to figure out, okay, cross-tenant communication is one thing, probably. What about the abuses on the feature? So nowadays, Gen Z, I hope there are so many Gen Zs here. I'm seeing that. I'm a millennial. So you people like loyalty programs, right? The banks are now focusing on loyalty programs. And there are rewards programs, and we want to earn rewards on various things. But nowadays, the bad actors are actually creating bots which actually misuses your loyalty programs, rewards. It's tried to steal from your rewards account, right? So I believe I have seen some of the banks, they use different authentication for a reward program and different authentication for your banking, right? So those are again based on the API itself. So I believe like you have a cross-tenant, then abuse of your bot, and then I think we should follow the traditional approach where we are actually checking for all input validation attacks. Nowadays, I feel like those are not that great problem because the programming frameworks are taken care. A lot of different things nowadays. This is what I feel.
No, thanks. I think misuse of APIs, leveraging loyalty programs, using bots, etc. I think that's become so rampant, and that's a great point that you brought in. Thanks, Sandeep. So why don't I go to you, Vinaya? So how would you reflect on this?
Sure. So I think there are two sides to this equation, like everyone said, right? You have a publisher of the APIs, which is the banks, the traditional banks, so now moving to the API model. And then you have the consumers, such as the fintechs, right, who are consuming these APIs. Now, on the publisher side, you have a problem where everybody wants to publish APIs because they want more fintechs to use their products, more savings accounts to be onboarded, more business and so on, right? So there is that, urgency in pushing APIs to production without thorough testing of those APIs, which gives to a lot of these cybersecurity attacks which can happen, right? Somebody, malicious actor, trying to hack into those APIs. On the other side, you have the, let's say, the fintech, where they probably don't follow very good data safety practices. For example, the API key. Sometimes you may have a developer who just checks into GitHub an API key, and then it's a public repository, for example. So then the API keys become public. So you need a really good data classification tool as well to tell you where the security flaws exist. Now, this is not a problem with the API itself per se, but still associated with the API. So you need to look at this holistically, not just the API design or API operation, but everything else you do around the API.
Sure. No, thanks. I think absolutely. I think the piece around how do you do secure coding practices, ensure that, right amount of diligence and testing has been done before API goes into production environment. I think those basic 101 principles are absolutely critical and important. Some thoughts from you, Nilesh?
So I think it has to be a very holistic approach, right? It has to, when you start, it has to be secure by design, so that, does your organization have a policy on APIs? Does he have a right set of SOPs for your developers to know what do's and don'ts of API? Does your testers know what needs to be tested? Do you have a DevSecOps process where, before anything goes into production, your APIs are thoroughly tested, vulnerability assessment, external penetration testing is done, whether you have third-party audits done periodically, not every day, but, and then do you do performance testing on those APIs? So that comes to testing in terms of development, obviously, ensure that you take care of the authorizations and authentication is not broken. You ensure that it's end-to-end encrypted, all the communication on APIs. You ensure that, you have a secure tokens which gets expired at regular frequencies. And token is used for every call that API is made. Okay, you have to ensure, you are using security certificate, entire your key management is properly handled there. Your, keys are regularly rotated. Okay, those areas you have to take care of. Then, once it is going into production, then how do you monitor that? Do you look at how many transactions per minute or transactions per seconds you are getting hit? Okay, have you built the baseline for that? Does it, sometimes it goes far beyond those, so then you have to worry, saying that why so many hits are coming from where? Have you done, IP whitelisting, that only certain IPs can hit those APIs? Have you done rate limiting? Very important part where sometimes, somebody can deluge it by number of transactions or by very high packet size. So do you do that or not? So these are some of the things, controls. One very big problem with, balancing the security and the functionality is that when we are building an API, we try to provide a lot of data thinking that this might be useful in the future. And then leave that portion to the, the consuming application, the endpoint, whatever they need, they will use that. So it's good that you don't have to develop that API again and again, but it leaves a lot of risk of providing unnecessary information to the endpoint, which can be then misused sometime if your endpoint is compromised. There's a leaky APIs, that can, create huge privacy concerns as we were talking about. And finally, if compromise happens, do you get to know that first? Because sometimes compromise go on for 6 months, 12 months before you get to know about it, which could cause a huge amount of data exfiltration. What is your incident response process? So all of these areas, end-to-end life cycle of API, we have to take care of.
No, thanks. And I think you've very nicely pivoted towards how do you secure APIs and what do you do. And I think there's a lot more that needs to be done. But I think one of the points that you brought out is rate limiting as well, right? So you've got to make sure that APIs don't you don't have a situation like a DDoS kind of a situation in the context of certain critical APIs, right? Where the entire mobile banking transaction feature kind of comes down. So absolutely, I think that's a great addition to the risk landscape that we all kind of spoke about. But maybe let's flip across, and maybe Sandeep, let me start from you this time, but let's flip across to say, now given some of these risks, right, whether it's a bot-led risk, whether it's a data exfiltration risk, a DDoS type risk, what should organizations do to start making it really secure? The ecosystem of APIs, how do you kind of secure that ecosystem? And some points were talked about around secure coding and testing, etc. But what beyond?
Yeah, I think first of all we need to deep dive. Fixing things are very, very difficult when we don't have a, I would say, culture of fixing. In this case, we probably using a different stacks of API. Maybe we are using a WebSocket. Maybe we are using a RPC, or maybe we are using the general JSON APIs, right? So in this case, we first of all need to figure out, are we hiring a third-party vendor who has this capability of testing this API? Does the partner understand what is the purpose of this API? Will he give a full coverage? Okay, once we understand all of this detail, probably we will be able to identify the problem first. So what I believe, many of the time what happens, we just see that some of the basic, I would say, use cases or test cases get executed, and this is where the actual vulnerability still exists, and maybe a bad actor someday he will recognize, okay, they are using WebSocket, but there is no CSRF token, because even on the OAuth top 10, there is no mention that you should use token for a WebSocket API, right? There's similarly so many other technology exist. So to fix that, I agree with the sir that we should have a secure coding, but on top of that, we should also need to understand if we are doing a pen test from last 3 years, how many pen tests has been performed, and what are the vulnerability which is coming every time regularly. Maybe a blind access payload is getting through that API, and that's the reason our developers are not able to understand maybe the injection part of the vulnerability. So this is where we need to understand, okay, this set of people need injection training, where where you can get them a training, so how to fix those kind of vulnerabilities, or how we should not reproduce next day when you will write the new code, right? So these kind of things probably we need to understand from the developer perspective. Apart from that, we also need to understand whoever is getting hired as a partner to ensure the security, they are receiving all downloads from the business. So this is where we will identify, and then we will be able to mitigate at the end, right? So coming back to the bot part, that's the trickiest part. You cannot fix it from code. For that, you need to implement a solution which understands the behavior of the request coming in from the API itself. I think back in time, web scrapper, or I would say today's date, I think it's very easy to scrap. Even APIs are much easier to scrap nowadays. It just takes a get or post request, which will scrap the entire data from the API itself. So we need to bring a solution which will at least understand the behavior, and it will stop accessing the bots as well. This is
sure.
what I feel,
No, absolutely. So you probably need to have some solution which actually looks at behavior
Yes.
Of a regular user versus a behavior of bots, and kind of codifies that behavior and is able to bring, cut off those API requests in many ways.
There can be a good bots. We don't want to stop Google to come in, but there might be a bot which is actually scrapping a data, maybe performing a credential stuffing attack, because we don't really care nowadays to add any random tokens to the authentication part, right? So there might be a credential stuffing always happens. In this case, the attackers nowadays are very smart. They have 70 millions of IP addresses, which is coming from data center, residential IP addresses, store IP addresses. There's so many different IP addresses there. And once that gets executed, you will feel like, okay, this seems to be like a regular user trying to visit it. But are we also doing a IP profiling on that request? If yes, then what is the risk score of that IP? And why we should allow on a critical operation, right? We say that APIs are now bringing a lot of, I would say, flexibility, but it also brings a lot of responsibility in terms of securing the data, during the transit itself. So we need to figure out good bot and bad bot, and based on that, we will able to mitigate some risk at least.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks so much. Vijay, any thoughts from your side?
See, I'm just trying to add to what the point was mentioning. See, when it comes to coding, it's not nowadays right from scratch coding kind of. You've gone to the level wherein you have the low code and no code kind of a thing and GUI based and all that stuff. So now, when you happen to do that, maybe that component which you're doing and trying to integrate in a modular form might be secure. But when you happen to integrate multiple things, the mechanism by way of which they connect may not be secure. And when they together might be totally vulnerable. We got to be very, very careful about that. So that means the most important thing, there are three aspects when it comes to API security. One is thorough testing of the integrated component, very important. And then whatever additional code that goes on integrating that two modules, that's very important. And the third part is this is only the one-time thing. You assess all that thing, you determine whether it is vulnerable at that particular juncture or whatsoever the case may be, but it has to be a continual event. That means you have to add a layer along with your web application firewall. You have the components now existing, which protects API on a continual basis. All these three has to be there. And in addition, it should not be the case that you perform a application testing right at one point of time. It has to be a continual event, coexist with that of the WAF plus API security. With that, probably you're better or your security posture is better. Does not necessarily mean that you're totally safe and secure and you can go to Hawaii. That's the point.
Thanks. Absolutely. I mean, a lot of testing and continuous testing is something that's going to be critical. And of course, testing it as a set of, not as individual components, but in entirety. So I think that's very, very important. But let me turn to you. I mean, what can be done from a monitoring standpoint in the context of APIs?
So I think every API has to have logging and monitoring enabled. Right, and there should be thresholds and checks and balances which are defined on every API. Now, instead of reinventing the wheel, what you can do is you can use best practices such as using an API gateway manager, because these are very tested and stable products which help you easily publish APIs. And a lot of the overhead of trying to do performance testing of an API, security testing, rate limits, and all of that, logging, monitoring, all of that is taken care of by that API gateway manager. And then you also can define a lot of alerts and checks and balances. If something is anomalous, the gateway manager will report it to you. So that you don't have to do this for every API you write. Rather, you just rely on that infrastructure to do it for you. So that's the best practice that you can follow.
Sure. No, absolutely. And I think logging, monitoring, all of that is critical. Just one more sort of follow-on question to you. I mean, in the context of APIs, I mean, as a practice, should we be looking at whitelisting or blacklisting the source from where you'd get API requests?
So I think the standard practice, and it's a best practice, is to actually whitelist. Because with whitelisting, you make sure that there are only specific IP addresses or domains from which requests can originate, and everything else is blocked out. And that's the concept of zero trust, right? Because you never trust and always verify. And that's the same principle applying to APIs as well, which is also very important, especially when you have these new age fintech brokers, where you have these fintech platforms who offer a variety of API services to other fintechs. In turn, they're integrating with several other banks and other institutions in the back end. So that becomes like a supply chain of APIs for you. And all of this becomes extremely critical there, because if you don't whitelist the source APIs, you're just exposing those APIs to the entire world, somebody to hack into it. So whitelisting would be the right way.
Sure. And you would reckon that whitelisting is the right way across all types of APIs, or it could be a risk-based approach, and certain APIs where the data is more or less public, you're willing to do it on a blacklisting basis, where you say anybody can come and integrate, you don't have to do a pre-assessment.
So I think what happens in that case is that just quickly goes out of hand. right? Because you're whitelisting some things, you're blacklisting some things, it becomes very difficult for you to manage and centralize. Right? So as a best practice, you just whitelist everything.
Sure. No, fair enough, fair enough. Any thoughts on this question?
Well, I think it's a absolutely public API, then whitelisting may not be practical. That time you'll have to go with certain IPs blacklisting. But other than that, most enterprise applications, whitelisting is a much better thing because you know who's going to consume it. So if it's a pure B2C kind of a requirement where anybody can come and consume that API, then blacklisting may be a right approach.
Sure. No, absolutely. I completely agree with both of you, but I just thought we should tease out this question a bit. The other sort of question is, before you whitelist, I mean, related to the same thing, before you whitelist, what should the organization do? And are there any things that one needs to keep in mind from a data privacy standpoint?
Correct. As I mentioned earlier, that what information that API is going to convey, is that all required to be consumed, or there are more purpose-built APIs. Same API could be broken into more than one if there is a different information requirement at the different endpoints. That's something that one has to explore. So that if you are exposing less information, there is a less risk of it getting compromised. So that's one area. And all the input validations, etc., whatever we discuss, all of those controls have to be built. Try passing it through API manager. Try through WAF. All of those, standard. If these are public APIs, then it's better to pass through WAF. And have a great inventory of the API list, what APIs organization has. I think we use a tool called Swagger, so which gives us documentation. We can do a lot of functional testing on that. So that's also very useful, to document it well and keep it updated regularly.
Sure. In fact, I was going to go to this question on inventorization of APIs. So maybe let me take this question across to you, Vijay. So how easy is it to inventorize APIs? What are some of the challenges in terms of, because you just like an asset inventory, you not need to have an API inventory as well. Only then can you secure it. So how easy is it?
Well, it's a difficult question posed to me at the first place. Most important thing is give the least information. You could see everybody's photograph is there, my photograph is not there. So that's well taken care of in my case, okay? Well, coming to the actuals, two things. If you happen to inventorize, then the most important catch is you do not allow any expansion. This probably could very well happen in the case of a bank, where it is from a conventional mode, highly regulated. So that's the reason where you have no choice but to ensure that you limit the API, data proliferation. So that is the primary important factor that need to be taken into consideration. But if it is going to be a generic organization or it's something, an R&D or anything, it has to be obviously an open thing. Why? Basically, they need to consume a lot of things and do a lot of analysis and before they integrate. Well, to be on the conservative side from a banking perspective, I would rather allow API to be open for the research and development part, wherein, of course, we will understand how that particular thing well integrates with our core banking system. Once that is decided, then probably we can bring it to the space there wherein production can very well absorb those APIs and integrate with any kind of open banking system as such.
Sure. No, thanks for that. So maybe I'll, at this point in time, open up the floor to the audience. If anybody from the audience has any questions, we'll have, the panel members would be happy to take that. Yeah, we'll just get a mic across to you. Yeah, there's one question here.
Hey, hi. So this is a very generic question across the board. We've spoken a lot about publishing APIs and the security while publishing APIs, because I'm sure that's the context that we are looking at. I'm also looking at when we are consuming APIs, because there are Google Maps APIs, there is now probably ChatGPT APIs, which our developers are consuming. So how would you go about identifying and securing them? Is there a process? Is there a method that you guys follow? So that's my basic question.
Okay. Anybody wants to take that?
So, for example, Google Maps API. So that API comes with a key. And today, you know, the Google Maps is not cheap. It's very expensive API, it hits. So how are you protecting that key? If the key is stored in the code, then it's less secure. So store it in a place with a secure vault within the app, so that if tomorrow somebody can easily reverse engineer a code on app, APK, and figure out that key and can misuse that key. So it could be a cost implication. So this is one example which comes to me while you are consuming the API, how you do it. Plus, for example, in a mobile app, you know, the certificate you have to pin. So pinning of that certificate is very important. Otherwise, that certificate itself can be, you know, reverse engineer and can be used. So obviously, you have to take care of it the other side also.
Do you guys have any guidelines or something that you publish for your dev teams that this is what it should be done when
Absolutely.
you're consuming?
Absolutely, yes.
Thanks, thank you.
Your name, please?
Chaitanya Kunte, risk quotient.
Okay. Hi, thanks, Chaitanya. Yeah.
Hello. As you have talked about the API standards and API security for the traditional approaches, what will be the perspective to secure the emerging approaches in banking, like neo-banking as well as the open banking standards? How will you implement the security standards for the API in such scenarios?
Anybody wants to take that?
So neo banking, or you know what you call API banking, it's nothing but, you know, there is a fintech who's offering a service to consumer, but using a bank at the back end. So between these two, that's going to be, all the communication is going to be API based. So whatever we spoke about securing that API, that has to come in play. But much beyond that, you have to look at a lot of regulatory aspects. You have to look at all the guidelines, you know, because somebody else is building the front end. It's not the bank which is managing that front end, but bank will be responsible if there is anything which is beyond regulation, then bank will be held responsible. So bank has to not only look at the API security, but overall the process, all the back end, front end, lots of validations and check that are built. If bank were to build its own front end, those all have to be put in place by the neo bank, which is there in the front of the bank. So with that, it will be a complete solution.
So, yeah, you want to add?
Yeah. So I think probably a best practice here again is that, you know, don't publish your entire user model through the API. Right? For example, if let's say you have a user profile screen, where you just need to show the first name, last name, date of birth. The API is supposed to return just that. It should not return additional things like your location, your account balance, and whatnot, right? So that way you should not rely on the front end or the GUI to select data and publish it on the front end. The API should ensure that it only gives you as much data as necessary, so that principle of data minimization has to be followed when designing the API itself.
And in addition, what to add here is that you should have all the back-end validations. Even though there is a front-end validation to something, front-end could easily be bypassed. So similar thing has to be authorized, authenticated, and validated at the back-end.
Yeah. So taking a cue from the last question, I think the problem is kind of, so we are an engineering first organization, primarily developers. And the problem I see is, as Sandeep mentioned earlier, there's different aspects to APIs and API development, right? A JSON guy would be very different than somebody who's coming from a WebSocket world. So in this case, I want to just understand from folks who are operating security in your companies, how are you bridging the talent gap, and how are you bridging the gap between engineering and security in this case? Because for web application, I think you have the standard set, and you have a security team who can handle things. OWASP Top 10 has been around for a while, and there's a lot of content online where people can go and train themselves. They're security folks. But when it comes to API or even DevSecOps, I really feel that security folks are not able to keep up with dev. And with dev, where security is deprioritized by nature, by design. So there's always this tussle that happens. So I'm just trying to understand with the lack of standards here. So we are consuming a lot of upstream APIs from banks. We are partnering with banks. We see that there's lack of standard within APIs themselves, the ones that we consume from one bank. So in this case, how do we standardize the whole thing, and also how do we deal with the talent and the operational inefficiencies that we have between security and engineering?
See, talent is a very important thing when it comes to any kind of an application integration, all that stuff. What you mentioned is absolutely right. The most important factor is educational institutions and the consumption that is happening in the industry is totally different. The guys who come from the industries are just barehanded when they happen to enter the actual organization. That is the fundamental flaw. We had been talking right from my days when I did my engineering, my post-graduation, all that stuff. The point is, there have been a lot of talks, okay, both from the educational institution side and also from the political arena. This personal information, okay, I'm not talking from the bank side or anything. Unfortunately, nothing has happened over the period of time. They all do not coexist, they are in silos. That's the fundamental gap. Now, coming to standardization of security and all that stuff, we leave it to specific organizations who are always trying to monetize on that particular thing. You have the SCI, the CMMI Institute, and all that guys. All are doing wonderful job. I'm not denying that. But the point is, ultimately, everyone is trying to monetize on specifics. This is the second part. Third part is, every organization by itself should, probably they can try to absorb what is existing in the market in terms of any standard, but they should tailorize all these things to that particular organization's recommend and ensure that the right set, what is required for their ecosystem is well taken care for. Without that, it is going to be a real problem. And on the other side, I would request if anybody representing educational institutions, always try to collaborate with the manufacturing industries, the banking industries, very, very important, so that there is absolutely a lot of interesting stuff going on and they understand what is required by the market. That's very important. We get a lot of graduate trainees and all that stuff. I mean, plant trainings and everyone. But point is, they are more interested in making a thesis after the 3-week period or a 3-month period, whatsoever the case may be. Instead, it should be productive, and it should be a mechanism which can be very well imbibed by that particular organization or a different organization, so that there is something which evolves. That's the most important key there. I'm not sure whether I answered the entire thing, but vaguely, I hope you're getting my point, I suppose.
I think maybe I'll just, on this one, I'll just come in a bit. Look, just like what we saw in the mobile apps world, right? When it actually started proliferating, the testers will always be behind the developers. And that you would have probably seen in the web app world, the mobile app world. Okay, but mobile app testing is now standardized. Maybe 8-9 years back, it was not. It was just the advent of mobile apps, and you didn't have standardized practices in testing. I think the same is going to happen in the API space as well. So it's always going to be a catch-up game. That's one. Second is, there is always pressure, especially in this world of fast-moving fintechs, and everybody wants to have the first mover advantage. There's going to be always stresses and strains between the app going live and testing. Yes, I think on this panel at least you've got people from banking, banking industry where things are a lot more structured. So while there is push and pull, at some level, risk management comes ahead of going live with something new. typically in a banking world. But if you look at a lot of, I mean, the fintech world and other industries, probably that's not the case. And therefore, we see a lot more of, vulnerabilities out there, a lot more hacks out there that kind of end up happening, right? So I think that's really, I mean, I hope that kind of gives you some perspective, but yeah. Yes, please.
I remember Merchant of Venice, not a penny more, not a penny less. Very important when you happen to do the API integration. Don't give anything more, anything less. What is asked is what is asked, nothing more. That's the point.
Absolutely. And with that, I think we'll bring this panel to a close. So thank you, everyone, and back to you.
From this discussion on the operations. So may I request for the mementos, please?